Please welcome my very, very good friend, Mr. Tim Merkel.
So the topic is identity crisis, which is convenient because I've had several. My first identity crisis was when I was 3 years old, and I realized that when I grew up, I could not be Blue from Blue's Clues. It was pretty devastating, but with support from friends and family, I was able to regain the will to continue on. My second identity crisis was a little bit later on when I was probably 7 or 8. I had 3 sisters and no brothers, so I was severely outnumbered, and I desperately wanted a brother. And I know that might sound maybe a little bit sexist, but bear in mind that this wasn't 2019. You know, we hadn't quite realized that women were just as good, if not even better than men. And that lasted for years. And you wouldn't think it would be that big of a deal, but it was really starting to take a toll on me. I remember one night while I was sewing clothes for stuffed animals, thinking, I really need a brother. But my next and ultimately probably greatest identity crisis started when I was around 12. Up until that point, my muscular dystrophy hadn't really affected me at all. I was able to do most of the things that a normal kid was able to do. But around the age of 12, I hit my growth spurt and I started growing faster than my muscles could keep up with. And I had to have several surgeries just to maintain the ability to walk. And I remember while recovering from one of these surgeries, I had gotten put on some sort of email like prayer chain by some guy, and I thought that was really nice because Christianity was also a big part of my identity. I grew up in a Christian household. There's going to be a little bit of religion in this because I think not enough people are talking about it these days, and I think it really makes everyone feel comfortable. Let's go with it. But I knew that I was supposed to find my identity in Christ. That's what people say. If you don't know what that means, that's what Christians say when they're worried that you're getting a bit too obsessed with like sports or grades or something. But I didn't really know what it means, and I didn't really think much about it. But more on that later. It was around this time that my second identity crisis had been resolved. My parents decided to adopt a boy from India, and I finally had the brother that I always wanted, which was awesome. Because it was also around this time that my disability started getting more and more, it started having more and more of an effect on my day-to-day life. I developed pretty severe scoliosis, like to the point where my spine was more in the shape of the word spine than what a spine was actually supposed to look like. So at the age of 14, I had a full spinal fusion, which was a really rough surgery. And it took me years to recover from that surgery. And in a lot of ways, I still really haven't fully recovered. And that's really when I went from sort of like people, being like, maybe there's something wrong with him, to it's like a full-blown, visibly, I use a walker to get around disability. And I think it's pretty easy to have an identity crisis when you have a very visible disability, because I think you start to notice that you become like less of a person in other people's eyes. And it was weird because it wasn't the bullies that affected you at all. I could handle myself. There was one time I almost got in a fight, but I was like, look, either you are the guy who becomes known for beating up a poor kid with a disability, or you're in an almost worse position where you become the guy that was beat up by someone with a disability. So it's kind of lose-lose. Surprisingly, that worked. But it's generally the people that mean very well that sometimes don't even realize what they're doing. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen like a parent whose kid is sort of like obliviously in the way of someone's path who has like a wheelchair or something. And usually either one of two things happen. Either they like yell at their kid really suddenly to get out of the way and like shock their kid, or they just like grab the kid and pull them away. And you're like, either way, that kid is going to grow up terrified to be around someone with a disability. But sorry, have you ever been so nervous that you forgot what happened in your own life? But those were the sorts of things that I had to deal with. I also managed to graduate high school in a couple of years that I was recovering from the spinal fusion, but it became pretty clear that I wasn't going to be able to go to a full-blown university yet. It was going to be too much, so I had to settle for going to community college. And at community college, aside from graduating, I had like one goal. Like, I wanted to make such an impact on the people that I met that my defining characteristic wasn't the fact that I have a disability. But that's actually pretty difficult because it's really easy, like, to be described as, oh yeah, it's the kid with the walker. And it's never really what you want to be described by. It's never like, oh yeah, he's the really nice kid with really nice eyelashes and great handwriting. Do you know who I'm talking about? By the time I graduated from community college, I had gotten the nickname Slim Tim, which in my mind seemed like a victory at the time, but looking back on it, it was a very, very small victory. But I was able to keep my grades up, and because I was a student with a disability, I was able to get a scholarship to afford to go to Drexel University in Philadelphia. And so that's what I did. And at Drexel, I struggled with my identity as someone with a disability too. Like, there were a lot of difficulties. The Office of Disabilities wasn't handicap accessible. That was hilarious. And it was a very stressful transition, trying to be independent in a city while pursuing a master's degree in electrical engineering. And I became so stressed out that I decided to join a Bible study. And it was a great Bible study. I had met a lot of really cool people that became very close friends. And they did this thing, which I found out about, where they would go out on campus and they would start talking to random people and ask them what is it that you believe in, and would basically just listen to people talk about their lives. And if they had any questions about Christianity, then we would try to answer them as best we could. And so I decided to try that. I gave it a shot. I was like, how hard could these questions be? I grew up in church. I can answer questions. No one's going to ask anything really difficult. And the first guy I talked to said, if God was good, why would he give you a disability? And sort of in that moment, I just had these waves of thoughts, which seemed like they were happening really slowly, but actually took place in a few seconds. Or maybe I was just staring at them for 15 minutes. I'm not really sure. But I began to think of sort of the trajectory of my life. And I remembered how I had been put on that email prayer chain. And the guy that I met because of that email prayer chain invited us to his church, and we went to his church, and that's where my parents found out about the orphanage in India where they went on to adopt my brother. And then I realized that because of the disability, I was able to afford to go to Drexel and to live in Philadelphia. And I started thinking of all the good things in my life and how they were pretty much a direct result from having a disability. So I guess if the question is, how could a good God give me a disability? Maybe the answer is just that our definition of good is different than God's definition of good. And at least in my life, he was able to turn something that everyone, including myself, thought was a bad thing and turn it into a good thing. And I think that's what it means to have your identity in Christ, is to know that the bad things are being turned into good things because of what you did. So, thank you.